If this profound exhaustion, this devastating desire to quit after achieving what you thought was your life's pinnacle, resonates with the hidden fatigue in your own heart, I urge you to do one small, necessary thing before we proceed further. Share this vulnerable reflection on spiritual burnout and resilience with one person you know who is currently searching for their purpose amidst their soul's weariness. They call me the Tishbite, the prophet of fire. The one who stood alone on Mount Carmel, called down the glory of the divine to consume the sacrifice and silence the blasphemous priests of Baal forever. The world saw the victory, the thunder, the power, the undeniable vindication. But what no human being truly saw was the fire that completely, violently extinguished itself within me the very moment the adrenaline faded and the sword finished its necessary, awful work. The man who defied a king and challenged 400 false prophets ran immediately afterward, not primarily from the queen's empty threat of death, but from the terrifying, unbearable emptiness in my own soul. I did not stop running until I reached this desolate, unforgiving wilderness, where I collapsed beneath this meager broom tree and, consumed by total exhaustion, made a single, desperate, and utterly sincere prayer. It is enough. Now, Eternal One, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Adin, my crisis was not a failure of courage. It was a devastating, total collapse of purpose fatigue and existential weariness that often strikes the mature soul after the great battle is supposedly won. The crushing spiritual burnout that followed that incredible high was a mental, physical, and spiritual annihilation. The pressure of standing as the singular, uncompromising representative of absolute truth, of having to be magnificent and infallible in the face of widespread corruption, had finally consumed every last internal resource I possessed. You who are in your maturity, you who have achieved massive success in your field, you know this feeling intimately. The terrible crash that follows a monumental achievement, the sharp, sickening realization that the immense effort did not, in fact, change the world or bring you the promised internal peace. I looked back at the mountain of victory, and all I could see was the vast, silent indifference of the people, the quick return of cynicism, and the renewed, persistent wickedness of the monarchy. The cost of that divine demonstration was the utter, complete depletion of my human spirit, leaving me dry and hollow. My faith in the eternal remained, solid as the rock of Horeb, but my fundamental will to continue, my desire to exist as the weary instrument of that faith, evaporated completely, leaving only a frightening, annihilating vacuum. The raw pain of this exhaustion is compounded by the profound, chilling isolation I have chosen to live in. For years, I believed I was the only one left fighting the relentless spiritual war. I was convinced I was the last voice crying out against the darkness. This belief, this crushing conviction of singular, indispensable responsibility, was the very delusion that broke me. It forced me to carry the entire, unshareable burden of an entire nation's destiny on my own shoulders, systematically preventing me from seeking aid, from sharing the immense spiritual load, or from showing the slightest human vulnerability. I had to perpetually maintain the mask of the fierce, unyielding, self-sufficient prophet, and the ultimate crushing price of that mask was the complete suppression of Elias, the man who desperately needed rest, who desperately craved community, and who desperately needed to be told that the spiritual fight was not his alone to win or lose. I truly believe I ran not from Jezebel's political sword, but from the horrifying realization that I was utterly, terribly alone in this immense spiritual landscape, and that self-imposed solitude had driven me to this complete, profound, nervous breakdown. When I woke beneath this meager tree, having been fed by the gentle hand of an angel, a direct, undeniable and tender touch from the divine, my first honest reaction was not gratitude or a renewed sense of surging mission, but an unyielding, paralyzing desire to simply go back to sleep and disappear forever. The meal was a staggering miracle, yet the fundamental, deep-seated weariness of my soul rejected even the miraculous sustenance of heaven, preferring oblivion. This is the insidious, terrifying nature of prophetic burnout. Even tangible proof of God's relentless presence cannot overcome the deep-seated fatigue born of decades of relentless, lonely effort and the internal metric of perceived failure. I did not actually fear physical death. I yearned for it, seeing it as the only final release from the unbearable, crushing responsibility of my continued existence, the only guaranteed way to cease being the constantly required miracle. I wanted to trade the thunder and fire of the mission for the quiet oblivion of the grave, convinced that my life's massive public work was definitively over and that it had all been catastrophically, heartbreakingly in vain. My desperate request to die under the broom tree was not a moment of irrational, fleeting despair. It was a conscious, reasoned, and profoundly exhausted decision born of a terrifying sense of purpose futility. "I'm no better than my fathers," I lamented, meaning that my efforts, even those validated by fire from the heavens, had achieved no permanent moral victory over the stubborn, cyclical wickedness of Israel. I saw the cyclical nature of human failure, the same corruption returning, the same complacency consuming the people the day after the miracle. And I concluded that the entire costly mission was ultimately pointless. This is the existential crisis that often strikes the mature. The painful realization that their monumental lifetime efforts, the successful business, the well-raised, now independent children, the political victory, did not fundamentally change the long-term, chaotic trajectory of the world. And that paralyzing feeling of ultimate insignificance is what finally makes the strongest among us collapse under the unbearable weight of our own past accomplishments. The intense pressure of being the man of God meant that I constantly lived my life straining in the gap between the impossible divine standard and the harsh human reality. And the anxiety of trying to perpetually bridge that gap alone was completely unsustainable. I falsely believed that every time I stood up to the forces of darkness, I had to carry the absolute certainty and the unbending power of the divine within my own frail flesh. But the human heart is not designed for perpetual certainty or constant solitary heroism. It is designed for rhythm, community, and profound rest. The fact that I had to flee, the fact that I broke down and openly begged for annihilation, was undeniable proof that my internal resources were not limitless, and my forced self-reliance was a profound spiritual arrogance that masked my fear. My biggest failure was not in running, but in tragically believing that the entire vast mission depended entirely and solely on my unique, individual, unbroken strength. A destructive lie that almost cost me everything of value. This deep, existential despair, ironically born of successful effort, is the fissure in the shield of every mature person who has carried a great burden for too long. You must understand that the fatigue you feel, the soul weariness that demands absolute stillness, is real, and it is valid, but it is not a condemnation of your worth or the ultimate validity of your purpose. It is a necessary siren call, a spiritual emergency demanding that you fundamentally change your strategy and stop relying solely on your own depleted will. Do not let the ghost of your past, tireless efforts sabotage the future peace and purpose you deserve. Stay with me, because the moment of true, unearned rest, the confrontation that finally forces the liberation from chronic effort and self-imposed solitude, is about to happen in the most unexpected, gentle silence imaginable. The true measure of my brokenness was not taken on the bloody slopes of Carmel, but here, in the cold, desolate heart of the wilderness, where the monumental event of my life became just a fading memory. The terrifying realization that struck me after the adrenaline dissipated was this: The grand success I achieved did not produce peace, but a dangerous, cavernous void of meaning. I had defined my entire identity by the spectacular doing, by the performance, the confrontation, the demonstration of power. When the spectacular was complete, when the external enemy was silenced, I was left with the profoundly unsettling silence of my own soul, and I discovered, with horror, that I had no internal resources left. The years of carrying the prophetic burden had rendered my inner temple completely desolate, a perfect metaphor for the burnout that consumes the dedicated soul in maturity. You have given everything to the mission, only to realize you have nothing left for yourself, and the reward of victory is simply the crushing weight of the next inevitable demand. My crisis was fundamentally one of isolation and utility. I was plagued by the conviction that I was the last true prophet left in Israel, the singular repository of spiritual integrity, and that if I failed, the whole mission would collapse into darkness. This belief, however noble its origin, was a psychological weapon that Jezebel herself couldn't have wielded more effectively. It prevented me from sharing my grief, from asking for help, and from admitting my humanity. The sheer weight of singular responsibility is unsustainable over decades. It breeds a toxic resentment toward the very people you are striving to save. This is the nature of the burnout that strikes those in leadership and caregiving roles in their later years. You become utterly consumed by the duty until you feel you have sacrificed your own soul on the altar of perpetual service. And the resultant bitterness is a poison that makes life unbearable. I found myself gripped by a deep, pervasive acedia, a spiritual weariness that is far heavier than physical fatigue. I was given food and water by the Eternal's messenger, enough to sustain me for 40 days and 40 nights. Yet I desired only to lie down and surrender to the dust. This is the crisis of the will. The body is nourished, but the soul refuses to be revived. I questioned the entire point of my existence, asking, what is the good of all this effort if the only result is this mortal exhaustion? I viewed the spiritual battle as a cyclical, pointless exercise, the perpetual triumph of evil over good, and I simply saw no reason to re-enter the arena. This feeling of futile repetition, the belief that all monumental efforts only lead back to the starting point of chaos and corruption, is the core despair of the mature soul who sees the pattern of history repeating itself. The wilderness, which should have been a place of restorative peace, became a terrifying echo chamber for my self-pity. My famous words, "I, even I only, am left," were not a statement of faith. They were a self-pitying lament, a plea for unique martyrdom. I demanded recognition for my solitary suffering, subconsciously seeking validation for the extraordinary price I had paid. But self-pity is a spiritual quicksand, a trap that isolates us further and paralyzes action. I had reduced the magnificent sweeping purpose of the divine to a pathetic ledger of my sacrifices versus their ingratitude. This obsession with my own singular effort prevented me from seeing the quiet, hidden faithfulness that still existed in the land, blinding me to the very community that could have pulled me out of my despair. My final retreat was driven by the overwhelming memory of the sheer noise of my life. The thunder, the fire, the clamor of the false prophets, the political screaming, all of it had assaulted my spirit until I could no longer hear the quiet counsel of my own heart or the gentle voice of the divine. I ran toward silence, but found only the terrifying vacuum of my own inner brokenness. I was a man who preached fire and power, yet internally I was a tinderbox, perpetually on the verge of total collapse. This constant, unsustainable intensity is the destructive rhythm many of you maintain in your careers and homes, believing that volume equals value. I realized that my most urgent need was not more power, but simply the courage to be vulnerable, to admit my utter depletion, and to seek sanctuary from the relentless demand for performance. The profound emptiness of this crisis was necessary, though terrifying. It was the only way to shatter the illusion of my self-sufficiency, the belief that my unique gift made me invincible to human weakness. I, who had demanded fire from heaven, now found myself begging for death under a scrubby tree. This total collapse was the divine strategy, to bring the powerful, self-reliant prophet to a point where his only option was surrender. The crisis of the broom tree was the ultimate act of grace, a brutal intervention designed to prove that the mission did not depend solely on my human, exhausted resources. It forced me to acknowledge that the source of power was external and that I was merely a fragile, highly volatile vessel. My friends, if you recognize this profound fatigue, the weight of purpose that crushes the joy from your life, the loneliness that drives you to withdraw, then you must stay with me. This journey through the wilderness of the soul is long, but it has a specific, revolutionary destination. Do not click away now. The resolution to this isolation, the moment I finally encountered the gentle, restorative power that shattered my cycle of self-reliance, is about to be revealed in the quietest, most unexpected confrontation of my life. The hardest lie I ever told was not directed at King Ahab or Queen Jezebel. It was the persistent, lethal lie I told to myself, that I was the only one who cared enough, who was strong enough, or who was righteous enough to carry this burden. This belief forced me to wear the mask of the indispensable prophet, the fierce, solitary figure who stood unafraid against an empire. The image was effective. It inspired awe and fear, but its price was the total destruction of my humanity. The mask made me rigid, unapproachable, and utterly incapable of asking for help, which I desperately needed. I deliberately cut myself off from community and counsel, believing that vulnerability was a contamination that would compromise my prophetic authority. This self-imposed isolation, disguised as spiritual purity, was the ultimate act of sabotage, ensuring that when the inevitable crash came, I would have no soft place to land, just the hard, unforgiving ground of the wilderness. The immense psychological toll of constantly maintaining this facade of autosufficiencia is what led to my collapse. I refused to delegate any spiritual burden, viewing any shared effort as a sign of weakness, or worse, a lack of faith in my own unique calling. I confess now that I resented the very people I was trying to save because I perceived them as too shallow, too uncommitted, and too quick to revert to Baal worship, proving that my great effort was unappreciated. This corrosive resentment, hidden beneath the righteous anger of the prophet, was the true price of my self-imposed isolation. By refusing to trust in the hidden faithfulness of others, I guaranteed my own exhaustion, believing the world would collapse if I dared to take a single vulnerable step back. This is the common destructive delusion of the high-achieving soul in maturity. The conviction that indispensable means invincible. My flight to the desert, therefore, was not merely a physical retreat. It was the desperate, final act of a man whose spirit had been consumed by the performance. I had used the mission as a fortress against my own human need for connection. Every miracle I performed, every public confrontation I instigated, was a way to maintain momentum and avoid the quiet, terrifying truth of my own profound spiritual loneliness. I was terrified of stopping because stopping meant facing the void, facing the reality that I was just a tired man, capable of fear and profound weariness. The moment Jezebel's empty threat sent me running, the mask finally cracked, revealing the extent of my emotional devastation and the raw, unacknowledged fear that had been fueling my hyper-productivity for decades. The intense action was merely a frantic defense mechanism against the stillness that brings accountability. This pattern, using hyperachievement to mask emotional emptiness, is deeply familiar to those of you who have climbed high in your careers or built impressive lives. You sacrificed rest, you sacrificed community, And you sacrificed vulnerability, all to sustain the image of the person who never breaks. You know the cost of the resentment that builds when you refuse to let others help. I realized in the searing heat of the wilderness that the perceived success of my loneliness was, in fact, the greatest tactical victory of the enemy. I had succeeded spectacularly in the public eye, only to fail tragically in the private arena of self-care and community, proving that a prophet can call down fire but still burn out completely from the lack of human connection. The consequence of my arrogance in believing that I alone was worthy of the task was the catastrophic failure to recognize the hidden reserve of purpose that still existed in the world. By claiming, I, even I only, am left, I was not just despairing. I was actively denying the work of the divine elsewhere, limiting the eternal to my own field of vision. This narrow, exhausted perspective, the belief that the entire solution depends only on my strained effort, is the hallmark of burnout and the greatest trap of maturity. It makes the world unbearably heavy because it places the weight of collective redemption onto one fragile human back. My self-pity, disguised as righteous zeal, was the price I paid for refusing to see the network of quiet support that I desperately needed to accept. My greatest shame was not the running, but the arrogance of my singular effort. I had turned the calling into a burden of personal achievement rather than a shared communal endeavor. This is the truth that must resonate with your own transition into maturity. The purpose of the next phase of life is to dismantle the very mask of self-sufficiency that built your success. You must learn that letting go is not failing. It is progressing to a higher form of service, one that relies on trust and shared wisdom rather than relentless individual output. The strength of the mature soul is the willingness to finally admit, with humility, that the task is too great for one person and that vulnerability is the necessary prerequisite for peace. This transition from solitary warrior to communal servant is the key to escaping the relentless cycle of burnout. If you recognize the cost of your own indispensable mask and are ready to trade the exhausting illusion of control for the peace of genuine vulnerability, I urge you to take action now. Pause this video and leave a single word in the comments that best describes the mask you are ready to put down today, e.g., invincible, perfect, solitary. Let us share the burden of this truth together. The journey to my confrontation with the void was a forced, desperate march that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, fueled by miraculous bread but driven by profound spiritual desperation. My destination was the sacred mountain of Horeb, the very place where Moses had received the law, the ultimate symbol of foundation and power. I sought the mountain not for solace, but for a final, thundering confirmation of my purpose, a spectacular event that would revalidate my immense suffering and justify my isolation. I hid in a cave, exhausted, resentful, and utterly certain that the divine would manifest in fire and fury to give me my new, powerful mandate. This hiding place became my dark night of the soul, where I finally stopped running from Jezebel, stopped running from my mission, and found myself face to face with the devastating emptiness of my own self-pity and my exhaustion. I was finally confronted, not by an enemy, but by a simple, terrifying question. What are you doing here, Elijah? This simple inquiry, posed in the stillness of the cave, was the catalyst for my collapse. It demanded an answer that went beyond mere justification or complaint. I answered with the script of my martyrdom. I have been very zealous for the eternal God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. I repeated the self-pitying lament that had defined my isolation, clinging to the belief that my singular effort was the only thing that mattered. I needed the divine to affirm my unique importance, to validate the crippling cost of my loneliness. demanding proof that my extreme burnout was justified by the extremity of my virtue. What followed was the spectacular event I thought I wanted, the demonstration of power that would justify my entire life. There came a great, violent wind, so powerful it tore the mountains and shattered the rocks, but the Eternal was not in the wind. Then an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the sacred mountain, but the Eternal was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, consuming and terrifying, but the Eternal was not in the fire. My greatest fear, which I had masked with relentless action, was that my intense effort, my spectacular performance, had been entirely in vain. The divine was refusing to validate the very things I had built my identity upon: the noise, the force, the dramatic confrontation. I realized with staggering clarity that I had been mistaking noise for power and performance for presence. This profound moment of non-manifestation, the divine's purposeful absence in the storm and the fire, was the true point of no return for my spiritual collapse. It shattered my entire rigid worldview. I had believed that only the overwhelming external demonstration of force could bring about change, and that I, as the vessel of that force, was indispensable. But the storm passed, the fire died, and I was left alone, humbled and terrified. My resistance, the part of me that desperately clung to the identity of the powerful, solitary hero, finally broke. I surrendered not to physical threat, but to the crushing weight of having been utterly wrong about the nature of true power. The truth was that the mission did not require my spectacular burnout. It required my humble, sustained presence. It was then, after the fire, that there came a sound of sheer silence. A still, small voice. It was not a roar of judgment or a command for another battle. It was a gentle, restorative whisper that bypassed the exhaustion of my mind and spoke directly to the profound need of my heart. This was the moment I finally broke the cycle of self-reliance. The divine was not demanding more zeal, more sacrifice, or more fire. It was offering rest, connection, and a gentler, more sustainable rhythm for the mission. The miracle that saved me was the quiet intimacy of being known and seen, not for the magnitude of my achievements, but for the depth of my utter depletion. The resolution to my burnout was not more work. It was the radical permission to cease the noise and accept the quiet power of relationship. This radical shift, from expecting a thunderous reward for my efforts to receiving a simple, quiet presence, is the profound wisdom that defines the transition out of purpose fatigue. You who are exhausted by the relentless demands of a life lived on high volume, stop searching for the great earthquake to validate your suffering. The power that truly saves is not found in the chaotic external event, but in the internal susurro suave that follows the letting go. The divine was teaching me, the exhausted man, that the mission was too big for one man, and that my immense effort was, in part, a refusal to trust in the quiet, hidden faithfulness of others. My healing began when I finally pulled my mantle over my face and simply listened to the silence. If you are standing today in your own spiritual cave, exhausted by the fire, shaken by the earthquake of your life's crises, and longing for a sign, know that the resolution is not a louder battle cry, but a deeper surrender to the stillness. I urge you to take this moment to seek the quiet. Commit to finding 10 minutes of absolute silence today. Turn off all screens and just listen for the subtle truth that your hyperproductivity has masked. Share the time you commit to silence in the comments below, acknowledging your need for rest. The overwhelming force of the silence that followed the fire was not meant to silence me forever. It was meant to shatter my delusion of indispensability. My greatest error, the source of my profound burnout, was the arrogance of believing that my purpose was to be the power, to conjure the fire, to control the storm, to stand as the solitary, spectacular demonstration of God's will. But the discovery made in that cave, born not of triumph, but of utter exhaustion, was that my ultimate purpose was non-heroic, quiet, and fundamentally concerned with transferal and simplification. I realized that the Eternal had rescued me not to send me back into the fight immediately, but to teach me a new, sustainable rhythm of service, one based on humility and delegation rather than frantic, singular effort. The value of my remaining life was no longer defined by the volume of my voice or the size of my miracles, but by the quiet courage to accept my limits and to acknowledge that the mission was too vast, too grand, to ever be contained within the finite life of one exhausted man, however zealous he might be. The voice, the still, small voice, systematically dismantled the central lie of my burnout. The idea that I, even I only, was left. My self-pity, that paralyzing spiritual quicksand, was predicated on the belief that I was the last bastion of faith, justifying my extreme isolation and my refusal to seek aid. But the divine revealed a startling truth. There were 7,000 in Israel whose knees had not bowed to Baal and whose mouths had not kissed him. This revelation was a profound, necessary humiliation. It proved that my isolation was a choice, fueled by arrogance and self-absorption, not a necessity dictated by the state of the nation. It shattered the dramatic narrative of my unique suffering and forced me to confront the reality that I had been blind to the quiet, hidden faithfulness all around me. My purpose was not to be the remnant. It was to find and empower the remnant, transforming my loneliness into a network of shared responsibility. This crucial insight forced the pivot from singular confrontation to communal preparation. My instructions were no longer to call down judgment, but to anoint Hazael as king over Syria, Jehu as king over Israel, and most crucially, Elisha as my successor. This was the ultimate non-heroic purpose of my maturity, the quiet, intentional transfer of the anointing. I, the prophet of fire, was being commanded to become the prophet of mentorship. The true work of my latter days was not the spectacle of the mountain, but the laborious daily work of pouring my spirit and my hard-won wisdom into the next generation. The strength of the maturity, I finally understood, is not the ability to do more, but the humility to empower others to do it better, accepting that the kingdom of God is built upon a chain of succession, not the unbroken singularity of one heroic figure. This act of anointing Elisha was the final, devastating blow to my ego and the definitive cure for my burnout. It meant accepting that I would not complete the final moral renovation of Israel. I would not build the permanent temple of righteousness that I had fought so hard for. Instead, my destiny was to prepare the person who would carry the baton further than I could have alone. My greatest contribution was no longer the performance of a miracle, but the gentle, necessary release of control. This realization is the cornerstone of renewed purpose for the mature soul. Your legacy is not found in clinging to the final glorious victory, but in ensuring that the next generation is properly equipped to inherit and advance the mission, even if their methods are different and their light shines brighter than yours ever did. The newfound peace I gained was directly proportional to the amount of control I relinquished. I stopped demanding the fire and started embracing the stillness. The healing of my deep soul weariness was not a sudden burst of energy, but the subtle, daily adjustment to a sustainable rhythm. I was free from the oppressive need to be spectacular, free from the crushing weight of singular infallibility. My strength was renewed not by more food or more sleep, but by the profound relief of knowing that the burden was finally shared. This non-heroic discovery, the power of humility and the deep satisfaction of delegation, is the secret weapon against the anxiety and purposelessness that often defines the post-peak stage of life. I spent my final years walking the land with Elisha, teaching, guiding, and observing the new life I had helped cultivate. My purpose had evolved from being the dramatic thunderclap of judgment to becoming the steady, nourishing rain of wisdom. I learned that true spiritual power is quiet, patient, and focused on nurturing growth, not on forcing immediate change. My most valuable moments were no longer spent confronting kings, but in the simple act of transference, pouring my history, my failures, and my faith into a receptive soul. This is the mature purpose, to turn the chaos of our past into the clarity of counsel for the future, transforming our old masks of sacrifice into the gentle face of mentorship. If you are currently wrestling with the painful transition from the doer to the delegator, from the solitary warrior to the mentor, know that your burnout is the alarm clock to this exact necessary evolution. Your deepest exhaustion is the signal that your method of operation is obsolete and unsustainable. You are being called out of the storm and into the quiet power of legacy, to ensure you never fall back into the trap of self-reliance and to keep receiving this vital wisdom on delegation and purpose. Take a moment now to hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell. Let us continue this journey of non-heroic purpose together, ensuring your next chapter is one of rest, clarity, and shared burden. If the exhaustion of your later years is whispering the same lies to you, that the effort was futile, that you are alone, and that the only answer is to quit, then this is the practical map for resilience I offer, forged in the terror of the wilderness and the humility of the cave. The first step toward healing your purpose fatigue is to adopt the rhythm of the angel's meal. My breakdown came because I had spent decades running on adrenaline and zeal, ignoring the profound human need for physical and spiritual rest. The angel, however, did not give me a sword or a new mission. He simply provided water and bread, commanding me to eat and sleep. This is your critical lesson. Your worth is not dependent on continuous output. The miracle of renewal begins with the radical, intentional acceptance of your need for sustenance and rest. Stop treating your body and soul like infinite machines. The map out of burnout is not a frantic search for a new goal, but the deliberate, disciplined practice of honoring your human limits and prioritizing your sustainable rest before the next great demand inevitably arises. Secondly, you must proactively dismantle the mask of the solitary hero. The devastating loneliness I experienced was self-imposed, fueled by the prideful conviction that I was the only faithful one. I urge you to look around you with fresh, open eyes and identify the 7,000 quiet allies, the hidden, faithful people in your life, your community, and your family, whose hearts have not bowed to the modern idols of chaos and materialism. Your strength in this mature phase is not found in standing alone, but in the courage to seek and receive assistance. Stop viewing delegation as a failure of competence. View it as an act of strategic trust and spiritual humility. The healing of isolation begins when you finally articulate your burden and allow others to share the load. Your true purpose now is to model vulnerability, showing that the most powerful figures are those willing to admit their deepest need for community and rest. The profound wisdom of the still, small voice offers the key to escaping the relentless cycle of performance addiction. I had spent my life seeking the fire, the thunder, and the violent external confirmation of my relevance, mistaking noise for power. But the voice came in the profound quiet, teaching me that the true, enduring power is found in the simplicity of presence. Your maturity must be defined by the deliberate choice to prioritize the whisper over the roar. Stop demanding that your life's meaning be validated by spectacular, external achievements that generate applause. The purpose that truly sustains is found in the quiet, consistent faithfulness, the small, almost invisible acts of mentorship, kindness, and simple duty that only you, with your lifetime of experience, can provide. The antidote to burnout is the revaluation of the simple, the steady, and the silent. Your unique contribution to the world in this second act lies in the intentional transferal of your accumulated wisdom. I was commanded to anoint Elisha, to pour my spirit and knowledge into a successor. Your purpose is not to cling desperately to the mantle of your former role, but to identify your Elisha, the person, the project, the successor, and invest fully in their growth. This transition from doer to delegator is not a demotion, it is an elevation to legacy. The strength of your later years is measured not by the territory you hold, but by the quality of the groundwork you lay for the next generation's success. Your fatigue is the divine signal that your mission has evolved from active conquest to profound, generative mentorship. Embrace the dignity of this non-heroic essential role. Embrace the inevitable realization that your most profound successes did not and could not solve the world's problems permanently. My victory on Carmel did not eliminate corruption, it merely bought time. This awareness, that effort yields progress, not permanence, is the final liberation from purpose anxiety. You are free from the impossible burden of being the ultimate solution. Your resilience is found in accepting the cyclical nature of effort and the perpetual need for faith, knowing that your part was merely one vital act in an eternal drama. This allows you to step back without guilt, confident that your sacrifice was meaningful, but knowing that the mission continues, sustained by forces far greater than your individual will. The map for your new beginning is ultimately a commitment to sustainability over spectacle. I learned that the fire was terrifying, but the stillness was restorative. You must guard your spirit with the same fierce protection you once used to guard your mission. Define your success now by the depth of your internal peace, the richness of your relationships, and the quality of the rest you allow yourself to receive. Your maturity has earned you the right to choose a rhythm of life that nourishes rather than destroys your soul. The greatest legacy you can leave is not a monument of achievement, but a testament to the beauty of a life lived with intentional boundaries and profound, sustained quietude. To cement this hard-won shift from self-reliance to sustainable peace, you must break the habitual patterns of your past. I urge you to take one concrete, practical step toward delegation and rest today. Find one task, whether professional or personal, that you are holding on to out of a misplaced sense of indispensable duty, and commit to transferring it to another person. Comment below with the task you are finally letting go of, e.g., "And I am letting go of managing the budget. I am delegating the worry." And let us celebrate this shared act of liberation. The final act of a prophet who once commanded fire is marked not by a triumphant return, but by a definitive, purposeful letting go. I stand now, having fully embraced the wisdom of the still, small voice, ready for the completion of my journey. The peace I carry is the profound, unshakable serenity that comes from finally understanding that my worth was never in the spectacle, the fire, the thunder, the dramatic confrontation, but in the simple, quiet act of being a faithful conduit. The greatest miracle of my maturity was the healing of my own desperate, isolated heart, achieved not through another supernatural display, but through the courage to accept rest and the humility to anoint Elisha. The mission continues, sustained not by my self-destructive zeal, but by the distributed strength of many. This acceptance that the work is too grand to fail simply because one weary man steps away is the ultimate freedom from the crushing burden of indispensability. My ascension, which the world remembers as a chariot of fire, was, for me, the ultimate spiritual resolution to my chronic burnout. It was the final, tangible proof that my exhaustion under the broom tree was not a failure of faith, but a necessary signal for transition. I did not die from the spiritual depletion I experienced. I was transformed by it. My mantle, the symbol of my authority, was purposefully left behind for Elisha. This transfer was my most vital act of leadership, the teaching that legacy is an intentional gift, not a burden to be hoarded until death. Your final crucial purpose in maturity is to consciously identify your own mantle, your unique wisdom, your honed skill, your spiritual focus, and pass it on fully, trusting in the preparedness and capacity of your successor. Only by fully letting go of the control can you truly gain the peace that accompanies completion. For those of you carrying the immense weight of purpose fatigue, the anxiety that strikes the strong, I offer the serenity I found in the silence. Your life's resolution is not dependent on securing a final, perfect victory, but on establishing a sustainable rhythm that honors your humanity. The terror of the wilderness was the price I paid for my arrogance, my belief that I could operate outside the natural laws of rest and community. I implore you to embrace the fact that your need for rest is not a spiritual flaw. It is a divine directive for longevity and health. Your greatest contribution now is to model intentional boundaries, showing the next generation that true power is found in the ability to say no to the chaos and yes to the quiet, restorative presence that sustains the soul. The final, essential wisdom for your maturity is this: the exhaustion you feel is not a permanent state. It is a temporary invitation to profound stillness. Stop equating your existence with continuous action. Your greatest legacy will be the story of how you survived the inevitable collapse of your strength and found the courage to embrace a new, simpler form of service. The quiet voice on the mountain taught me that the divine is not found in the fire of performance, but in the silence of vulnerability. The peace you crave is waiting for you at the end of your self-imposed race, demanding only that you drop the burden of singular effort and accept the profound rest that your soul has earned. I look down at the world I fought for, and I see its beauty and its chaos continuing. I accept that my work was not to permanently fix the world, but to faithfully execute my part, and then trust others to execute theirs. This profound liberation from ultimate responsibility is the crowning achievement of the mature life. Your anxiety will only dissolve when you finally acknowledge that your personal effort, however zealous, is one thread in a vast tapestry, and the fate of the whole does not rest solely on your frayed end. Embrace your own profound significance, then gracefully step back to appreciate the beauty of the ongoing work from a place of peace. My life's ultimate victory was found in a cave, in the absence of a storm, in the quiet affirmation of my worth beyond my work. I urge you to seek your own moment of profound stillness and accept the truth it offers. Do not let the pursuit of purpose kill the purpose itself. I ask you to make a final, lasting commitment to your sustained well-being. Share a powerful personal reflection on this video, describing the moment your fire almost burned you out, and how you are choosing to listen to the susurro suave now. Let us turn this conversation into a permanent, shared resource for rest and healing. And so, the journey of the prophet of fire ends not in fire, but in peace, leaving behind a mantle and a new way of seeing the world. The greatest strength is the humility to be saved. Closing phrase, profound and final. I thought the strength was in the fire, but the true power was in the silence. Your burnout is not the end of your mission. It is the powerful invitation to find your ultimate peace in the quiet act of letting go.